Chapter 104. More experiments in dietetics. I was anxious to observe Brahmacharya in thought, word and deed, and equally anxious to devote the maximum of time to the satyagraha struggle and fit myself for it by cultivating purity. I was therefore led to make further changes and to impose greater restraints upon myself in the matter of food. The motive for the previous changes had been largely hygienic, but the new experiments were made from a religious standpoint. Fasting and restriction in diet now played a more important part in my life. Passion in man is generally coexistent with a hankering after the pleasures of the palate. And so it was with me. I have encountered many difficulties in trying to control passion as well as taste, and I cannot claim even now to have brought them under complete subjection. I have considered myself to be a heavy eater. What friends have thought to be my restraint has never appeared to me in that light. If I had failed to develop restraint to the extent that I have, I should have descended lower than the beasts and met my doom long ago. However, as I had adequately realized my shortcomings, I made great efforts to get rid of them, and thanks to this endeavor I have all these years pulled on with my body and put in with it my share of work. Being conscious of my weakness and unexpectedly coming in contact with congenial company, I began to take an exclusive fruit diet or to fast on the Ekadashi day, and also to observe Janmashtami and similar holidays. I began with a fruit diet, but from the standpoint of restraint I did not find much to choose between a fruit diet and a diet of food grains. I observed that the same indulgence of taste was possible with the former as with the latter, and even more when one got accustomed to it. I therefore came to attach greater importance to fasting or having only one meal a day on holidays. And if there was some occasion for penance or the like, I gladly utilized it too for the purpose of fasting. But I also saw that, the body now being drained more effectively, the food yielded greater relish, and the appetite grew keener. It dawned upon me that fasting could be made as powerful a weapon of indulgence as of restraint. Many similar later experiences of mine as well as of others can be adduced as evidence of this starting fact. I wanted to improve and train my body, but as my chief object now was to achieve restraint and a conquest of the palate, I selected first one food and then another, and at the same time restricted the amount. But the relish was after me, as it were. As I gave up one thing and took up another, this latter afforded me a fresher and greater relish than its predecessor. In making these experiments I had several companions, the chief of whom was Herman Kallenbach. I have already written about this friend in the history of Satyagraha in South Africa, and will not go over the same ground here. Mr. Kallenbach was always with me, whether in fasting or in dietetic changes. I lived with him at his own place when the Satyagraha struggle was at its height. We discussed our changes in food and derived more pleasure from the new diet than from the old. Talk of this nature sounded quite pleasant in those days, and did not strike me as at all improper. Experience has taught me, however, that it was wrong to have dwelt upon the relish of food. One should eat not in order to please the palate, but just to keep the body going. When each organ of sense subserves the body and through the body the soul, its special relish disappears, and then alone does it begin to function in the way nature intended it to do. Any number of experiments is too small and no sacrifice is too great for attaining this symphony with nature. But unfortunately the current is nowadays flowing strongly in the opposite direction. We are not ashamed to sacrifice a multitude of other lives in decorating the perishable body and trying to prolong its existence for a few fleeting moments, with the result that we kill ourselves, both body and soul. In trying to cure one old disease, we give rise to 100 new ones. In trying to enjoy the pleasures of sense, we lose in the end even our capacity for enjoyment. All this is passing before our very eyes, but there are none so blind as those who will not see. Having thus set forth their object and the train of ideas which led up to them, I now propose to describe the dietetic experiments at some length. Chapter 105. Casterby's Courage. Thrice in her life my wife narrowly escaped death through serious illness. The cures were due to household remedies. At the time of her first attack, satyagraha was going on or was about to commence. She had frequent hemorrhage. A medical friend advised a surgical operation to which she agreed after some hesitation. She was extremely emaciated and the doctor had to perform the operation without chloroform. It was successful, but she had to suffer much pain. She, however, went through it with wonderful bravery. The doctor and his wife who nursed her were all attention. This was in Durban. The doctor gave me leave to go to Johannesburg and told me not to have any anxiety about the patient. In a few days, however, I received a letter to the effect that Casterby was worse, too weak to sit up in bed, and had once become unconscious. The doctor knew that he might not, without my consent, give her wines or meat. So he telephoned to me at Johannesburg for permission to give her beef tea. I replied saying I could not grant the permission, but that, if she was in a condition to express her wish in the matter, she might be consulted and she was free to do as she liked. But, said the doctor, I refuse to consult the patient's wishes in the matter. You must come yourself. If you do not leave me free to prescribe whatever diet I like, I will not hold myself responsible for your wife's life. I took the train for Durban the same day and met the doctor who quietly broke this news to me. I had already given Mrs. Gandhi beef tea when I telephoned to you. Now, doctor, I call this a fraud, said I. No question of fraud in prescribing medicine or diet for a patient. In fact, we doctors consider it a virtue to deceive patients or their relatives, if thereby we can save our patients, said the doctor with determination. I was deeply pained but kept cool. The doctor was a good man and a personal friend. He and his wife had laid me under a debt of gratitude, but I was not prepared to put up with his medical morals. Doctor, tell me what you propose to do now. I would never allow my wife to be given meat or beef, even if the denial meant her death, unless of course she desired to take it. You are welcome to your philosophy. I tell you that, so long as you keep your wife under my treatment, I must have the option to give her anything I wish. If you don't like this, I must regretfully ask you to remove her. I can't see her die under my roof. Do you mean to say that I must remove her at once? Whenever did I ask you to remove her? I only want to be left entirely free. If you do so, my wife, and I will do all that is possible for her, and you may go back without the least anxiety on her score. But if you will not understand this simple thing, you will compel me to ask you to remove your wife from my place. I think one of my sons was with me. He entirely agreed with me and said his mother should not be given beef tea. I next spoke to Casterby herself. She was really too weak to be consulted in this matter, but I thought it my painful duty to do so. I told her what had passed between the doctor and myself. She gave a resolute reply, I will not take beef tea. It is a rare thing in this world to be born as a human being, and I would far rather die in your arms than pollute my body with such abominations. I pleaded with her. I told her that she was not bound to follow me. I cited to her the instances of Hindu friends and acquaintances who had no scruples about taking meat or wine as medicine. But she was adamant. No, said she, pray remove me at once. I was delighted. Not without some agitation, I decided to take her away. I informed the doctor of her resolve. He exclaimed in a rage, what a callous man you are. You should have been ashamed to broach the matter to her in her present condition. I tell you, your wife is not least little hustling. I shouldn't be surprised if she were to die on the way. But if you must persist, you are free to do so. If you will not give her beef tea, I will not take the risk of keeping her under my roof even for a single day. So we decided to leave the place at once. It was drizzling and the station was some distance We had to take the train from Durban for Phoenix, whence our settlement was reached by a road of 2.5 miles. I was undoubtedly taking a very great risk, but I trusted in God and proceeded with my task. I sent a messenger to Phoenix in advance, with a message to West to receive us at the station with a hammock, a bottle of hot milk and one of hot water, and 6 men to carry Kasturbai in the hammock. I got a rickshaw to enable me to take her by the next available train, put her into it in that dangerous condition, and marched away. Kasturbai needed no cheering up. On the contrary, she comforted me, saying, "Nothing will happen to me. Don't worry." She was mere skin and bone, having had no nourishment for days. The station platform was very large, and as the rickshaw could not be taken inside, one had to walk some distance before one could reach the train. So I carried her in my arms and put her into the compartment. From Phoenix we carried her in the hammock, and there she slowly picked up strength under hydropathic treatment. In 2 or 3 days of our arrival at Phoenix, a Swami came to our place. He had heard of the resolute way in which we had rejected the doctor's advice, and he had, out of sympathy, come to plead with us. My second and third sons Manilal and Ramdas were, so far as I can recollect, present when the Swami came. He held forth on the religious harmlessness of taking meat, citing authorities from Manu. I did not like his carrying on this disputation in the presence of my wife, but I suffered him to do so out of courtesy. I knew the verses from the Manusmriti, I did not need them for my conviction. I knew also that there was a school which regarded these verses as interpolations, but even if they were not, I held my views on vegetarianism independently of religious texts, and Kasturbai's faith was unshakable. To her the scriptural texts were a sealed book, but the traditional religion of her forefathers was enough for her. The children swore by their father's creed, and so they made light of the Swami's discourse. But Kasturbai put an end to the dialogue at once. "Swamiji," she said, "whatever you may say, I do not want to recover by means of beef tea. Pray don't worry me any more. You may discuss the thing with my husband and children if you like. But my mind is made up." Chapter 106. Domestic Satyagraha. My first experience of jail life was in 1908. I saw that some of the regulations that the prisoners had to observe were such as should be voluntarily observed by a brahmachari, that is, one desiring to practice self-restraint. Such, for instance, was the regulation requiring the last meal to be finished before sunset. Neither the Indian nor the African prisoners were allowed tea or coffee. They could add salt to the cooked food if they wished, but they might not have anything for the mere satisfaction of the palate. When I asked the jail medical officer to give us curry powder and to let us add salt to the food whilst it was cooking, he said, "You are not here for satisfying your palate. From the point of view of health, curry powder is not necessary, and it makes no difference whether you add salt during or after cooking." Ultimately these restrictions were modified, though not without much difficulty, but both were wholesome rules of self-restraint. Inhabitants imposed from without rarely suit, but when they are self-imposed, they have a decidedly salutary effect. So, immediately after release from jail, I imposed on myself the 2 rules. As far as was then possible, I stopped taking tea and finished my last meal before sunset. Both these now require no effort in the observance. There came, however, an occasion which compelled me to give up salt altogether, and this restriction I continued for an unbroken period of 10 years. I had read in some books on vegetarianism that salt was not a necessary article of diet for man, that on the contrary saltless diet was better for the health. I had deduced that a brahmachari benefited by a saltless diet. I had read and realized that the weak-bodied should avoid pulses. I was very fond of them. Now it happened that Kasturbai, who had a brief respite after her operation, had again begun getting hemorrhage, and the malady seemed to be obstinate. Hydropathic treatment by itself did not answer. She had not much faith in my remedies, though she did not resist them. She certainly did not ask for outside help. So when all my remedies had failed, I entreated her to give up salt and pulses. She would not agree, however much I pleaded with her, supporting myself with authorities. At last she challenged me, saying that even I could not give up these articles if I was advised to do so. I was pained and equally delighted in that I got an opportunity to shower my love on her. I said to her, "You are mistaken. If I was ailing and the doctor advised me to give up these or any other articles, I should unhesitatingly do so. But there, without any medical advice, I give up salt and pulses for 1 year, whether you do so or not." She was rudely shocked and exclaimed in deep sorrow, "Pray forgive me. Knowing you, I should not have provoked you. I promise to abstain from these things, but for heaven's sake take back your vow. This is too hard on me. It is very good for you to forego these articles. I have not the slightest doubt that you will be all the better without them. As for me, I cannot retract a vow seriously taken, and it is sure to benefit me. For all restraint, whatever prompts it, is wholesome for men. You will therefore leave me alone. It will be a test for me and a moral support to you in carrying out your resolve." So she gave me up. "You are too obstinate. You will listen to none," she said, and sought relief in tears. I would like to count this incident as an instance of satyagraha, and it is one of the sweetest recollections of my life. After this, Kasturbai began to pick up quickly, whether as a result of the saltless and pulseless diet, or of the other consequent changes in her food, whether as a result of my strict vigilance in exacting observance of the other rules of life, or as an effect of the mental exhilaration produced by the incident, and if so, to what extent, I cannot say. But she rallied quickly, hemorrhage completely stopped, and I added somewhat to my reputation as a quack. As for me, I was all the better for the new denials. I never craved for the things I had left. The year sped away, and I found the senses to be more subdued than ever. The experiment stimulated the inclination for self-restraint, and I returned to India. Only once I happened to take both the articles, whilst I was in London in 1914. But of that occasion, and as to how I resumed both, I shall speak in a later chapter. I have tried the experiment of a saltless and pulseless diet on many of my co-workers, and with good results in South Africa. Medically, there may be two opinions as to the value of this diet, but morally I have no doubt that all self-denial is good for the soul. The diet of a man of self-restraint must be different from that of a man of pleasure, just as their ways of life must be different. Aspirants after Brahmacharya often defeat their own end by adopting courses suited to a life of pleasure. Chapter 107. Towards Self-Restraint. I have described in the last chapter how Kasturbai's illness was instrumental in bringing about some changes in my diet. At a later stage, more changes were introduced for the sake of supporting Brahmacharya. The first of these was the giving up of milk. It was from Rachenbai that I first learnt that milk stimulated animal passion. Books on vegetarianism strengthened the idea, but so long as I had not taken the Brahmacharya vow, I could not make up my mind to forego milk. I had long realized that milk was not necessary for supporting the body, but it was not easy to give it up. While the necessity for avoiding milk in the interests of self-restraint was growing upon me, I happened to come across some literature from Calcutta describing the tortures to which cows and buffaloes were subjected by their keepers. This had a wonderful effect on me. I discussed it with Mr. Kallenbach. Though I have introduced Mr. Kallenbach to the readers of the history of Satyagraha in South Africa, and referred to him in a previous chapter, I think it necessary to say something more about him here. We met quite by accident. He was a friend of Mr. Khan's, and as the latter had discovered deep down in him a vein of otherworldliness, he introduced him to me. When I came to know him, I was startled at his love of luxury and extravagance. But at our very First meeting, he asked searching questions concerning matters of religion. We incidentally talked of Gautam Buddha's renunciation. Our acquaintance soon ripened into very close friendship, so much so that we thought alike, and he was convinced that he must carry out in his life the changes I was making in mine. At that time he was single and was expending 1,200 rupees monthly on himself, over and above house rent. Now he reduced himself to such simplicity that his expenses came to 120 rupees per month. After the breaking up of my household and my first release from jail, we began to live together. It was a fairly hard life that we led. It was during this time that we had the discussion about milk. Mr. Kallenbach said, "We constantly talk about the harmful effects of milk. Why then do not we give it up? It is certainly not necessary." I was agreeably surprised at the suggestion, which I warmly welcomed, and both of us pledged ourselves to abjure milk there and then. This was at Tolstoy Farm in the year 1912. But this denial was not enough to satisfy me. Soon after this I decided to live on a pure fruit diet. And that too composed of the cheapest fruit possible. Our ambition was to live the life of the poorest people. The fruit diet turned out to be very convenient also. Cooking was practically done away with. Raw groundnuts, bananas, dates, lemons, and olive oil composed our usual diet. I must here utter a warning for the aspirants of Brahmacharya. Though I have made out an intimate connection between diet and Brahmacharya, it is certain that mind is the principal thing. A mind consciously unclean cannot be cleansed by fasting. Modifications in diet have no effect on it. The concupiscence of the mind cannot be rooted out except by intense self-examination, surrender to God, and lastly grace. But there is an intimate connection between the mind and the body, and carnal mind always lusts for delicacies and luxuries. To obviate this tendency, dietetic restrictions and fasting would appear to be necessary. The carnal mind, instead of controlling the senses, becomes their slave, and therefore the body always needs clean, non-stimulating foods and periodical fasting. Those who make light of dietetic restrictions and fasting are as much in error as those who stake they're all on them. My experience teaches me that, for those whose minds are working towards self-restraint, dietetic restrictions and fasting are very helpful. In fact, without their help, concupiscence cannot be completely rooted out the mind. Chapter 108. Fasting. Just about the time when I gave up milk and cereals and started on the experiment of a fruit diet, I commenced fasting as a means of self-restraint. In this Mr. Kallenbach also joined me. I had been used to fasting now and again, but for purely health reasons. That fasting was necessary for self-restraint I learned from a friend. Having been born in a Vaishnava family and of a mother who was given to keeping all sorts of hard vows, I had observed, while in India, the Ekadashi and other fasts, but in doing so I had merely copied my mother and sought to please my parents. At that time I did not understand, nor did I believe in, the efficacy of fasting. But seeing that the friend I have mentioned was observing it with benefit and with the hope of supporting the Brahmacharya vow, I followed his example and began keeping the Ekadashi fast. As a rule, Hindus allow themselves milk and fruit on a fasting day, but such fast I had been keeping daily. So now I began complete fasting, allowing myself only water. When I started on this experiment, the Hindu month of Shravan and the Islamic month of Ramzan happened to coincide. The Gandhis used to observe not only the Vaishnava but also the Shaivite vows, and visited the Shaivite as also the Vaishnava temples. Some of the members of the family used to observe Pradosha in the whole of the month of Shravan. I decided to do likewise. These important experiments were undertaken while we were at Tolstoy Farm, where Mr. Kallenbach and I were staying with a few Satyagrahi families, including young people and children. For these last we had a school. Among them were 4 or 5 Musulmans. I always helped and encouraged them in keeping all their religious observances. I took care to see that They offered their daily namaz. There were Christians and Parsi youngsters too, whom I considered it my duty to encourage to follow their respective religious observances. During this month, therefore, I persuaded the Musulman youngsters to observe the Ramzan fast. I had of course decided to observe Pradosha myself, but I now asked the Hindu, Parsi and Christian youngsters to join me. I explained to them that it was always a good thing to join with others in any matter of self-denial. Many of the farm inmates welcomed my proposal. The Hindu and the Parsi youngsters did not copy the Musulman ones in every details. It was not necessary. The Musulman youngsters had to wait for their breakfast until sunset, whereas the others did not do so, and were thus able to prepare delicacies for the Musulman friends and serve them. Nor had the Hindu and other youngsters to keep the Musulmans company when they had their last meal before sunrise next morning, and of course all except the Musulmans allowed themselves water. The result of these experiments was that all were convinced of the value of fasting, and a splendid esprit de corps grew up among them. We were all vegetarians on Tolstoy Farm, thanks, I must gratefully confess, to the readiness of all to respect my feelings. The Musulman youngsters must have missed their meat during Ramzan, but none of them ever let me know that they did so. They delighted in and relished the vegetarian diet, and the Hindu youngsters often prepared vegetarian delicacies for them, in keeping with the simplicity of the farm. I have purposely digressed in the midst of this chapter on fasting, as I could not have given these pleasant reminiscences anywhere else, and I have indirectly described a characteristic of mine. Namely that I have always loved to have my co-workers with me in anything that has appealed to me as being good. They were quite new to fasting, but thanks to the Pradosha and Ramzan fasts, it was easy for me to interest them in fasting as a means of self-restraint. Thus an atmosphere of self-restraint naturally sprang up on the farm. All the farm inmates now began to join us in keeping partial and complete fasts, which, I am sure, was entirely to the good. I cannot definitely say how far this self-denial touched their hearts and helped them in their striving to conquer the flesh. For my part, however, I am convinced that I greatly benefited by it, both physically and morally. But I know that it does not necessarily follow that fasting and similar disciplines would have the same effect for all. Fasting can help to curb animal passion only if it is undertaken with a view to self-restraint. Some of my friends have actually found their animal passion and palate stimulated as an after-effect of fasts. That is to say, fasting is futile unless it is accompanied by an incessant longing for self-restraint. The famous verse from the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita is worth noting in this connection. For a man who is fasting his senses outwardly, the sense objects disappear, leaving the yearning behind, but when he has seen the highest, even the yearning disappears. Fasting and similar discipline is, therefore, one of the means to the end of self-restraint, but it is not all, and if physical fasting is not accompanied by mental fasting, it is bound to end in hypocrisy and disaster. Chapter 109. As schoolmaster. The reader will, I hope, bear in mind the fact that I am, in these chapters, describing things not mentioned or only cursorily mentioned in the history of Satyagraha in South Africa. If he does so, he will easily see the connection between the recent chapters. As the farm grew, it was found necessary to make some provision for the education of its boys and girls. There were, among these, Hindu, Musulman, Parsi and Christian boys and some Hindu girls. It was not possible, and I did not think it necessary, to engage special teachers for them. It was not possible, for qualified Indian teachers were scarce, and even when available, none would be ready to go to a place 21 miles distant from Johannesburg on a small salary. Also, we were certainly not overflowing with money, and I did not think it necessary to import teachers from outside the farm. I did not believe in the existing system of education, and I had a mind to find out by experience and experiment the true system. Only this much I knew, that, under ideal conditions, true education could be imparted only by the parents, and that then there should be the minimum of outside help, that Tolstoy farm was a family, in which I occupied the place of the father, and that I should so far as possible shoulder the responsibility for the training of the young. The conception no doubt was not without its flaws. All the young people had not been with me. Since their childhood, they had been brought up in different conditions and environments, and they did not belong to the same religion. How could I do full justice to the young people thus circumstanced, even if I assumed the place of paterfamilias? But I had always given the first place to the culture of the heart or the building of character, and as I felt confident that moral training could be given to all alike, no matter how different their ages and their upbringing, I decided to live amongst them all the 24 hours of the day as their father. I regarded character building as the proper foundation for their education, and if the foundation was firmly laid, I was sure that the children could learn all the other things themselves, or with the assistance of friends. But as I fully appreciated the necessity of a literary training in addition, I started some classes with the help of Mr. Kallenbach and Sjt Praji Desai. Nor did I underrate the building up of the body. This they got in the course of their daily routine. For there were no servants on the farm, and all the work, from cooking down to scavenging, was done by the inmates. There were many fruit trees to be looked after, and enough gardening to be done as well. Mr. Kallenbach was fond of gardening and had gained some experience of this work in one of the governmental model gardens. It was obligatory on all, young and old, who were not engaged in the kitchen, to give some time to gardening. The children had the lion's share of this work, which included digging pits, felling timber, and lifting loads. This gave them ample exercise. They took delight in the work, and so they did not generally need any other exercise or games. Of course, some of them, and sometimes all of them, malingered and shirked. Sometimes I connived at their pranks, but often I was strict with them. I dare say they did not like the strictness, but I do not recollect their having resisted it. Whenever I was strict, I would, by argument, convince them that it was not right to play with one's work. The conviction would, however, be short-lived. The next moment they would again leave their work and go to play. All the same, we got along, and at any rate they built up fine physiques. There was scarcely any illness on the farm, though it must be said that good air and water and regular hours of food were not a little responsible for this. A word about vocational training. It was my intention to teach every one of the youngsters some useful manual vocation. For this purpose, Mr. Kallenbach went to a Trappist monastery and returned having learnt shoemaking. I learned it from him and taught the art to such as were ready to take it up. Mr. Kallenbach had some experience of carpentry, and there was another inmate who knew it, so we had a small class in carpentry. Cooking almost all the youngsters knew. All this was new to them. They had never even dreamt that they would have to learn these things someday. For generally the only training that Indian children received in South Africa was in the 3 Rs. On Tolstoy farm, we made it a rule that the youngsters should not be asked to do what the teachers did not do, and therefore, when they were asked to do any work, there was always a teacher cooperating and actually working with them. Hence, whatever the youngsters learned, they learned cheerfully. Literary training and character building must be dealt with in the following chapters. Chapter 110. Literary training. It was seen in the last chapter how we provided for the physical training on Tolstoy farm and, incidentally, for the vocational. Though this was hardly done in a way to satisfy me, it may be claimed to have been more or less successful. Literary training, however, was a more difficult matter. I had neither the resources nor the literary equipment necessary, and I had not the time I would have wished to devote to the subject. The physical work that I was doing used to leave me thoroughly exhausted at the end of the day, and I used to have the classes just when I was most in need of some rest. Instead, therefore, of my Being fresh for the class, I could with the greatest difficulty keep myself awake. The mornings had to be devoted to work on the farm and domestic duties, so the school hours had to be kept after the midday meal. There was no other time suitable for the school. We gave 3 periods at the most to literary training. Hindi, Tamil, Gujarati and Urdu were all taught, and tuition was given through the vernaculars of the boys. English was taught as well. It was also necessary to acquaint the Gujarati Hindu children with a little Sanskrit and to teach all the children elementary history, geography and arithmetic. I had undertaken to teach Tamil and Urdu. The little Tamil I knew was acquired during voyages and in jail. I had not got beyond Pope's excellent Tamil handbook. My knowledge of the Urdu script was all that I had acquired on a single voyage, and my knowledge of the language was confined to the familiar Persian and Arabic words that I had learned from contact with Musulman friends. Of Sanskrit I knew no more than I had learnt at the high school. Even my Gujarati was no better than that which one acquires at the school. Such was the capital with which I had to carry on. In poverty of literary equipment my colleagues went one better than I. But my love for the languages of my country, my confidence in my pupils, and more than that, their generosity, stood me in good stead. The Tamil boys were all born in South Africa and therefore knew very little Tamil and did not know the script at all. So I had to teach them the script and the rudiments of grammar. That was easy enough. My pupils knew that they could any day beat me in Tamil conversation, and when Tamilians, not knowing English, came to see me, they became my interpreters. I got along merrily, because I never attempted to disguise my ignorance from my pupils. In all respects I showed myself to them exactly as I really was. Therefore, in spite of my colossal ignorance of the language, I never lost their love and respect. It was comparatively easier to teach the Musulman boys Urdu. They knew the script. I had simply to stimulate in them an interest in reading and to improve their handwriting. These youngsters were for the most part unlettered and unschooled. But I found in the course of my work that I had very little to teach them, beyond weaning them from their laziness and supervising their studies. As I was content with this, I could pull on with boys of different ages and learning different subjects in one and the same classroom. Of textbooks, about which we hear so much, I never felt the want. I do not even remember having made much use of the books that were available. I did not find it at all necessary to load the boys with quantities of books. I have always felt that the true textbook for the pupil is his teacher. I remember very little that my teachers taught me from books, but I have even now a clear recollection of the things they taught me independently of books. Children take in much more and with less labor through their ears than through their eyes. I do not remember having read any book from cover to cover with my boys. But I gave them, in my own language, all that I had digested from my reading of various books, and I dare say they are still carrying a recollection of it in their minds. It was laborious for them to remember what they learned from books, but what I imparted to them by word of mouth, they could repeat with the greatest ease. Reading was a task for them, but listening to me was a pleasure when I did not bore them by failure to make my subject interesting. And from the questions that my talks prompted them to put, I had a measure of their power of understanding. Chapter 111. Training of the Spirit. The spiritual training of the boys was a much more difficult matter than their physical and mental training. I relied little on religious books for the training of the spirit. Of course, I believed that every student should be acquainted with the elements of his own religion and have a general knowledge of his own scriptures, and therefore I provided for such knowledge as best I could. But that, to my mind, was part of the intellectual training. Long before I undertook the education of the youngsters of the Tolstoy farm, I had realized that the training of the spirit was a thing by itself. To develop the spirit is to build character and to enable one to work towards a knowledge of God and self-realization. and I held that this was an essential part of the training of the young and that all training without culture of the spirit was of no use and might be even harmful. I am familiar with the superstition that self-realization is possible only in the fourth stage of life, i.e., sannyasa, renunciation. But it is a matter of common knowledge that those who defer preparation for this invaluable experience until the last stage of life attain not self-realization but old age, amounting to a second and pitiable childhood, living as a burden on this earth. I have a full recollection that I held these views even whilst I was teaching IE in 1911-12, though I might not then have expressed them in identical language. How then was this spiritual training to be given? I made the children memorize and recite hymns, and read to them from books on moral training. But that was far from satisfying me. As I came into closer contact with them, I saw that it was not through books that one could impart training of the spirit. Just as physical training was to be imparted through physical exercise, even so the training of the spirit was possible only through the exercise of the spirit. And the exercise of the spirit entirely depended on the life and character of the teacher. The teacher had always to be mindful of his P's and Q's, whether he was in the midst of his boys or not. It is possible for a teacher situated miles away to affect the spirit of the pupils by his way of living. It would be idle for me, if I were a liar, to teach boys to tell the truth. A cowardly teacher would never succeed in making his boys valiant, and a stranger to self-restraint could never teach his pupils the value of self-restraint. I saw therefore that I must be an eternal object lesson to the boys and girls living with me. They thus became my teachers, and I learned I must be good and live straight, if only for their sakes. I may say that the increasing discipline and restraint I imposed on myself at Tolstoy Farm was mostly due to those wards of mine. One of them was wild, unruly, given to lying, and quarrelsome. On one occasion he broke out most violently. I was exasperated. I never punished my boys, but this time I was very angry. I tried to reason with him, but he was adamant and even tried to overreach me. At last I picked up a ruler lying at hand and delivered a blow on his arm. I trembled as I struck him. I dare say he noticed it. This was an entirely novel experience for them all. The boy cried out and begged to be forgiven. He cried not because the beating was painful to him. He could, if he had been so minded, have paid me back in the same coin, being a stoutly built youth of 17, but he realized my pain in being driven to this violent resource. Never again after this incident did he disobey me. But I still repent that violence I am afraid I exhibited before him that day not the spirit, but the brute in me. I have always been opposed to corporal punishment. I remember only one occasion on which I physically punished one of my sons. I have therefore never until this day been able to decide whether I was right or wrong in using the ruler. Probably it was improper, for it was prompted by anger and a desire to punish. Had it been an expression only of my distress, I should have considered it justified. But the motive in this case was mixed. This incident set me thinking and taught me a better method of correcting students. I do not know whether that method would have availed on the occasion in question. The youngster soon forgot the incident, and I do not think he ever showed great improvement. But the incident made me understand better the duty of a teacher towards his pupils. Cases of misconduct on the part of the boys often occurred after this, but I never resorted to corporal punishment. Thus, in my endeavor to impart spiritual training to the boys and girls under me, I came to understand better and better the power of the Spirit. Chapter 112. Tares among the wheat. It was at Tolstoy Farm that Mr. Kallenbach drew my attention to a problem that had never before struck me. As I have already said, some of the boys at the farm were bad and unruly. There were loafers too amongst them. With these my 3 boys came in daily contact, as also did Other children of the same type as my own sons. This troubled Mr. Kallenbach, but his attention was centered on the impropriety of keeping my #boys with these unruly youngsters. One day he spoke out, "Your way of mixing your own boys with the bad ones does not appeal to me. It can have only one result. They will become demoralized through this bad company." I do not remember whether the question puzzled me at the moment, but I recollect what I said to him. "How can I distinguish between my boys and the loafers? I am equally responsible for both. The youngsters have come because I invited them. If I were to dismiss them with some money, they would immediately run off to Johannesburg and fall back into their old ways. To tell you the truth, it is quite likely that they and their guardians believe that, by having come here, they have laid me under an obligation. That they have to put up with a good deal of inconvenience here, you and I know very well. But my duty is clear. I must have them here, and therefore my boys also must needs live with them. And surely you do not want me to teach my boys to feel from today that they are superior to other boys. To put that sense of superiority into their heads would be to lead them astray. This association with other boys will be a good discipline for them. They will of their own accord learn to discriminate between good and evil. Why should we not believe that if there is really anything good in them, it is bound to react on their companions? However that may be, I cannot help keeping them here, and if that means some risk, we must run it." Mr. Kallenbach shook his head. "The result, I think, cannot be said to have been bad. I do not consider my sons were any the worse for the experiment. On the contrary, I can see that they gained something. If there was the slightest trace of superiority in them, it was destroyed, and they learned to mix with all kinds of children. They were tested and disciplined. This and similar experiments have shown me that, if good children are taught together with bad ones and thrown into their company, they will lose nothing, provided the experiment is conducted under the watchful care of their parents and guardians. Children wrapped up in cotton wool are not always proof against all temptation or contamination. It is true, however, that when boys and girls of all kinds of upbringing are kept and taught together, the parents and the teachers are put to the severest test. They have constantly to be on the alert." Chapter 113. Fasting as Penance. Day by day it became increasingly clear to me how very difficult it was to bring up and educate boys and girls in the right way. If I was to be their real teacher and guardian, I must touch their hearts. I must share their joys and sorrows. I must help them to solve the problems that faced them, and I must take along the right channel the surging aspirations of their youth. On the release of some of the satyagrahis from jail, Tolstoy Farm was almost denuded of its inmates. The few that remained mostly belonged to Phoenix. So I removed them there. Here I had to pass through a fiery ordeal. In those days I had to move between Johannesburg and Phoenix. Once when I was in Johannesburg, I received tidings of the moral fall of 2 of the inmates of the ashram. News of an apparent failure or reverse in the satyagraha struggle would not have shocked me, but this news came upon me like a thunderbolt. The same day I took the train for Phoenix. Mr. Kallenbach insisted on accompanying me. He had noticed the state I was in. He would not brook the thought of my going alone, for he happened to be the bearer of the tidings which had so upset me. During the journey my duty seemed clear to me. I felt that the guardian or teacher was responsible, to some extent at least, for the lapse of his ward or pupil. So my responsibility regarding the incident in question became clear to me as daylight. My wife had already warned me in the matter, but being of a trusting nature, I had ignored her caution. I felt that the only way the guilty parties could be made to realize my distress and the depth of their own fall would be for me to do some penance. So I imposed upon myself a fast for 7 days and a vow to have only 1 meal a day for a period of 4 months and a half. Mr. Kallenbach tried to dissuade me, but in vain. He finally conceded the propriety of the penance and insisted on joining me. I could not resist his transparent affection. I felt greatly relieved, for the decision meant a heavy load off my mind. The anger against the guilty party subsided and gave place to the purest pity for them. Thus considerably eased, I reached Phoenix. I made further investigation and acquainted myself with some more details I needed to know. My penance pained everybody, but it cleared the atmosphere. Everyone came to realize what a terrible thing it was to be sinful, and the bond that bound me to the boys and girls became stronger and truer. A circumstance arising out of this incident compelled me, a little while after, to go into a fast for 14 days, the results of which exceeded even my expectations. It is not my purpose to make out from these incidents that it is the duty of a teacher to resort to fasting whenever there is a delinquency on the part of his pupils. I hold, however, that some occasions do call for this drastic remedy. But it presupposes clearness of vision and spiritual fitness. Where there is no true love between the teacher and the pupil, where the pupil's delinquency has not touched the very being of the teacher, and where the pupil has no respect for the teacher, fasting is out of place and may even be harmful. Though there is thus room for doubting the propriety of fasts in such cases, there is no question about the teacher's responsibility for the errors of his pupil. The first penance did not prove difficult for any of us. I had to suspend or stop none of my normal activities. It may be recalled that during the whole of this period of penance I was a strict fruitarian. The latter part of the second fast went fairly hard with me. I had not then completely understood the wonderful efficacy of Ramanama, and my capacity for suffering was to that extent less. Besides, I did not know the technique of fasting, especially the necessity of drinking plenty of water, however nauseating or distasteful it might be. Then the fact that the first fast had been an easy affair had made me rather careless as to the second. Thus during the first I took coon baths every day, but during the second I gave them up after 2 or 3 days and drank very little water, as it was distasteful and produced nausea. The throat became parched and weak, and during the last days I could speak only in a very low voice. In spite of this, however, my work was carried on through dictation where writing was necessary. I regularly listened to readings from the Ramayana and other sacred books. I had also sufficient strength to discuss and advise in all urgent matters. Chapter 114. To meet Gokhale. I must skip many of the recollections of South Africa. At the conclusion of the Satyagraha struggle in 1914, I received Gokhale's instruction to return home via London. So in July, Kasturbai, Kallenbach and I sailed for England. During Satyagraha I had begun traveling third class. I therefore took third-class passages for this voyage. But there was a good deal of difference between third-class accommodation on the boat on this route and that provided on Indian coastal boats or railway trains. There is hardly sufficient sitting, much less sleeping, accommodation in the Indian service, and little cleanliness. During the voyage to London, on the other hand, there was enough room and cleanliness, and the steamship company had provided special facilities for us. The company had provided reserved closet accommodation for us, and as we were fruitarians, the steward had orders to supply us with fruits and nuts. As a rule, third-class passengers get little fruit or nuts. These facilities made our 18 days on the boat quite comfortable. Some of the incidents during the voyage are well worth recording. Mr. Kallenbach was very fond of binoculars and had 1 or 2 costly pairs. We had daily discussion over one of these. I tried to impress on him that this possession was not in keeping with the ideal of simplicity that we aspired to reach. Our discussions came to a head one day as we were standing near the porthole of our cabin. Rather than allow these to be a bone of contention between us, why not throw them into the sea and be done with them, said I. Certainly throw the wretched things away, said Mr. Callenbach. I mean it, said I. So do I, quickly came the reply. And forthwith I flung them into the sea. They were worth some £7, but their value lay less in their price than in Mr. Callenbach's infatuation for them. However, having got rid of them, he never regretted it. This is one out of the many incidents that happened between Mr. Callenbach and me. Every day we had to learn something new in this way, for both of us were trying to tread the path of truth. In the march towards truth, anger, selfishness, hatred, etc. naturally give way for. Otherwise truth would be impossible to attain. A man who is swayed by passions may have good enough intentions, may be truthful in word, but he will never find the truth. A successful search for truth means complete deliverance from the dual throng such as of love and hate, happiness and misery. Not much time had elapsed since my fast when we started on our voyage. I had not regained my normal strength. I used to stroll on deck to get a little exercise so as to revive my appetite and digest what I ate. But even this exercise was beyond me, causing pain in the calves, so much so that on reaching London I found that I was worse rather than better. There I came to know Dr. Jivraj Mehta. I gave him the history of my fast and subsequent pain, and he said, if you do not take complete rest for a few days, there is a fear of your legs going out of use. It was then that I learned that a man emerging from a long fast should not be in a hurry to regain lost strength, and should also put a curb on his appetite. More caution and perhaps more restraint are necessary in breaking a fast than in keeping it. In Madeira we heard that the Great War might break out at any moment. As we entered the English Channel, we received the news of its actual outbreak. We were stopped for some time. It was a difficult business to tow the boat through the submarine mines which had been laid throughout the channel, and it took about 2 days to reach Southampton. War was declared on the 4th of August. We reached London on the 6th. Chapter 115. My part in the war. On arrival in England I learned that Gauquelet had been stranded in Paris, where he had gone for reasons of health, and as communication between Paris and London had been cut off, there was no knowing when he would return. I did not want to go home without having seen him, but no one could say definitely when he would arrive. What then was I to do in the meanwhile? What was my duty as regards the war? Sarabji Ajaniya, my comrade in jail and a satyagrahi, was then reading for the bar in London. As one of the best satyagrahis, he had been sent to England to qualify himself as a barrister so that he might take my place on return to South Africa. Dr. Pranjavandas Mehta was paying his expenses. With him and through him I had conferences with Dr. Jivraj Mehta and others who were prosecuting their studies in England. In consultation with them, a meeting of the Indian residents in Great Britain and Ireland was called. I placed my views before them. I felt that Indians residing in England ought to do their bit in the war. English students had volunteered to serve in the army, and Indians might do no less. A number of objections were taken to this line of argument. There was, it was contended, a world of difference between the Indians and the English. We were salves and they were masters. How could a slave cooperate with the master in the hour of the latter's need? Was it not the duty of the slave, seeking to be free, to make the master's need his opportunity? This argument failed to appeal to me then. I knew the difference of status between an Indian and an Englishman, but I did not believe that we had been quite reduced to slavery. I felt then that it was more the fault of individual British officials than of the British system, and that we could convert them by love if we would improve our status. Through the help and cooperation of the British, it was our duty to win their help by standing by them in their hour of need. Though the system was faulty, it did not seem to me to be intolerable, as it does today. But if, having lost my faith in the system, I refused to cooperate with the British government today, how could those friends then do so, having lost their faith not only in the system but in the officials as well? The opposing friends felt that was the hour for making a bold declaration of Indian demands and for improving the status of Indians. I thought that England's need should not be turned into our opportunity, and that it was more becoming and farsighted not to press our demands while the war lasted. I therefore adhered to my advice and invited those who would to enlist as volunteers. There was a good response. Practically all the provinces and all the religions being represented among the volunteers. I wrote a letter to Lord Crewe, acquainting him with these facts and expressing our readiness to be trained for ambulance work, if that should be considered a condition precedent to the acceptance of our offer. Lord Crewe accepted the offer after some hesitation and thanked us for having tendered our services to the Empire at that critical hour. The volunteers began their preliminary training in first aid to the wounded under the well-known Dr. Cantley. It was a short course of 6 weeks, but it covered the whole course of first aid. We were a class of about 80. In 6 weeks we were examined, and all except one passed. 4. These the government now provided military drill and other training. Colonel Baker was placed in charge of this work. London in these days was a sight worth seeing. There was no panic, but all were busy helping to the best of their ability. Able-bodied adults began training as combatants, but what were the old, the infirm and the women to do? There was enough work for them if they wanted. So they employed themselves in cutting and making clothes and dressings for the wounded. The Lyceum, a ladies' club, undertook to make as many clothes for the soldiers as they could. Srimati Sarojini Naidu was a member of this club and threw herself wholeheartedly into the work. This was my first acquaintance with her. She placed before me a heap of clothes which had been cut to pattern, and asked me to get them all sewn up and return them to her. I welcomed her demand and with the assistance of friends got as many clothes made as I could manage. During my training for first aid,